Well, I will officially welcome you all to this conversation. Hey, Becca. Hey, Brandon. Thanks for being here
Hello.
with me.
Hey.
Can you put yourselves in context? I'm Daniel. I wrote that book. I host the Facilitation Masterclass for people who haven't been here before. Brendan, Becca, can you say a little bit more about yourselves?
Sure. Becca Thompson. I manage proposals for a large consulting company, and I often lead groups and work with them on developing really creative strategies to go to market.
And I'm Brandon Tidwell, and I work for a major retailer. I'm a UX design instructor. And so I do a lot of work facilitating learning, and then also in a very meta way, also am teaching classes to teach people how to facilitate. So that was why I wanted to take the master class, was to become both a better educator and also to pick up some tips and tricks on how to educate other people to become better facilitators.
Yeah. And I think this is where the two of you had this really amazing reflection at the end of the master class that just finished. And the tips and tricks mindset is something that I always have my own internal struggle with, where there are things that you can do that make it better versus it's something owning that, and the fluid performance of those tips and tricks comes from a much more complex relationship with yourself and the knowledge. And so that's something that I personally struggle with, that like, yes, here are all the tips and tricks, here's the recipe book, versus helping people find their own path and their own way. And I think, so I wanted to unpack those two, the reflections that you'd both had at the end of the masterclass. And Brandon, maybe we can start with you, because you talked about games you play. And I think this is something that people say a lot. It's like, I want a toolbox, and I want to have like a big toolbox of more games to play, versus understanding how to design a new game anytime I need to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was so I came, like I said, I came into the course thinking, oh, well, this will be like so many other courses that I've taken where it's about tips and tricks, and that what I'll be getting out of this is, I think of them as games, because to me, tools are kind of like the more practical operational things of facilitating, but like the games are things like, oh, well, here's a game to help you lead people to divergent thinking. Here's a game to help people prioritize things,
Sure.
all of those different sorts of things. And I didn't get it at first. I think it was when I was reflecting with my peer group, maybe the second week, where we were talking about, it was after we had a discussion about structured versus unstructured. And what the pros and cons are of those two different kinds of facilitation techniques, where I start to realize, oh, wow, like really what's happening is I'm thinking about how to facilitate. And that then with all of this experience with the labs, of getting the opportunity to think about, okay, well, what kind of game do I want to create? And how do I go about creating something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. Becca, what does that spark in you? Because I see you nodding too.
It just really mimics it. It's kind of the second class epiphany or something, where I came into it thinking, okay, this is going to be tips and tricks. And now that I think about it, it'd be so silly, because you could put that on a blog in 5 points, like 5 tips and tricks for this. And yet it's a 12-week masterclass, so I should have expected more. I apologize. But
I should have explained it better. Clearly, that's why we're having this conversation.
But the good thing was, I think it was the second time we met, I realized that it was much more than that, and it was really a deeper skill set that we were developing. It was beyond, do these 5 things for success. It was really on reading the room and figuring out if we needed structure, less structure, and how to work with a group and get them to where they needed to be.
Yeah. This question of where does the group need to be is such a powerful question, because reading the room and deciding where do I think they need to be, where do they want to go, and what's the intervention that will help move us in that direction, I would say that's non-trivial. There are some tips for that, like how to read the room. And as you said, Brandon, choices you can make, like more structure versus less structure, when to step in and also when to lean back. And I think maybe that goes to your perspective, Becca, because I love the analogy. I love cooking and baking. And I love the idea that with like flour and butter and eggs and water, you can make a scone, you can make a muffin, you can make a cookie, right? It just depends on the proportions and what you want to make.
Mm-hmm. So when we talked, and I still stand by it because I also like cooking and baking, and I love a cookbook. I'm a cookbook girl. You know, give me the directions, I can follow the directions, and then give me some tips or tricks or high altitude baking extra stuff. I can put those in. So I think that I entered the class thinking I would leave with a cookbook. I would leave with a prescribed ingredient list and steps, and then some little extras over here. Oh, if you want to make little manipulations, here's what you do. And what I ended up leaving with was really the skill set to act more as the chef, kind of creating the games, creating the recipes, adding more ingredients where I needed to, because I know how they play together and kind of the science that goes into it, and to creating something that works for everybody, instead of saying, oh, you need more salt. Nope, not in the recipe. We're not doing more salt. Like, you're going to take this as it comes and it's going to work. That to me was beyond valuable, and it has continued to be valuable. And I mean, even through the master class, but even, you know, to infinity and beyond, still using a lot of it.
Well, I mean, I guess, did you guys get some games and some recipes also?
Yes. I think for me, the two major, well, yeah, we didn't get any information. The two major things was kind of continually coming back to, well, if there's conflict or if something's not aligning, that is a conversation. Like, have the conversation, don't make the assumption. Some real reminders and encouragement about showing up and clarifying where we need to clarify, and just being open and honest, and making sure, you know, communication is very transparent. And then for me, one of the most helpful tools that I got was a concept, big arc, little arc, for meeting planning. And I use it. It's like a drawing so I can visualize it. I have shared it with teams. It's helped them see how a session is going to progress and how we're going to build up. And really, it helps us kind of all understand what that end goal is. And it has helped things run so much smoother, because everybody understands really the goal that we're trying to reach. And so immediately there's just a little bit more buy-in. I'm not doing anything to somebody. We're all doing this together, and we're all moving down the path.
That sparks a lot in me. Is there more that you want to say? Because I want to hear what Brandon might have to say that sparks in him.
I also want to hear what Brandon has to say.
I think, well, I was definitely nodding my head, you know, big arc, little arc, and how that landed for me was the process of creating intentionality around facilitating. You know, like we say, you know, like there being like three parts, you know, but I had not really had a technique to sit down and kind of draw out and think about, okay, this piece is going to go into this piece, and it's going to go into this piece, and this is what I'm trying to achieve. I think it goes a lot to kind of like, you know, what you're talking about in Good Talk, which is about being intentional about thinking about, well, what kind of conversation are you trying to have, and how can, and what's the framework you're going to use to get there. So, and then specifically in that, tools that I got was these conversations like I keep on thinking about the like creative tensions, like
Mhm.
this idea of using a spectrum of
Mhm.
some sort to help the group to learn about itself,
Mm.
and using that as a tool to get things started, because I think that that then very clearly establishes for the room who's in the room and how are we similar and how are
Mhm.
we different. And uh, as a facilitator, leading people to do to put something
Mhm.
on attentions, but then asking the group, well, what do
Yeah.
you what are we seeing here? So I think that was just super valuable to me.
Mm. It's so interesting because I love games. I love icebreakers. And people often ask me like, oh, what's an icebreaker or a game I could play to start this meeting? And I'm like, well, what is your goal for the meeting? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And there's nothing wrong with, I just saw a mural shared a Nicolas Cage check-in where it was like, like 9 different Nicolas Cage drawings. So it's like, oh, which Nicolas Cage do you identify with? Right. And Becca's like, that's fun, that's goofy. And that is totally okay to start with fun and goofy. But starting with like, hey, put yourself on the spectrum of like, how close to done are we? How close to good are we? Right. And just be like, oh, that's a very different icebreaker. Let's talk about the work, but in a fun way. And those are really different choices. And I can't, this is where, Becca, the thing about cooking, I don't know if you've ever watched Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat on Netflix. She's like, yeah, have
Yeah.
I? I love that show. And if you haven't watched it, Brandon, it's amazing. She's I don't remember her full name, but she's just so full of life. And she's her point of view is here are these 4 key ingredients: salt, fat, and acid, heat. And if you deeply understand them, deeply understand them, you can understand all types of cooking. And that's true. But I think everyone also has their secret ingredient or their favorite ingredient. I use the example of like paprika or za'atar. Like once you learn a new spice, you're like, oh, this is interesting. Like, where could I use that? And that's where I think when people learn like bullseye diagramming or abstraction laddering or some game, a tool, they're like, oh my God, I can use this anywhere. And you're like, well, easy on the paprika, buddy. You can't put it in everything.
Yeah, and I think that that goes back to the master class is that it 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 creates the ability to think about and have think about the context for why you're going to be doing a game,
Yeah.
which I don't think that I thought about enough about how I was using the different activities or games when I was facilitating.
Mm.
I was thinking about what I wanted to get out of them, but not necessarily how they would piece together. And I always had an uneasiness about, okay, well, what am I going to do if this activity doesn't work?
Mm.
And now I feel much more confident that that I can be okay with it not working, and I can take a step back,
Mm.
and that I can actually create a game on the fly, or I can engage the group in figuring out, well, what does the next activity need to be? Because I think there's a lot of, I've always felt a lot of pressure as a facilitator to be like, this game doesn't work. Well, what about this game? What about this game? What about this game? And instead I can just sit back and pause and then initiate a conversation to say, okay, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? And enroll the participants in creating whatever game it is that we need to play.
To build on that, one of my favorite things about the master class was one of the things I was kind of most reluctant to participate in, and that was the labs. And I didn't know what I wanted to try out or experiment. And at the end of the day, it was a pretty organic lab for me because it was something that it was built on an exercise I did the prior week that wasn't as successful as I wanted it to be. So then I made some tweaks and I was able to try it out with other people and then get some really great feedback on it. And it was so helpful. And it helped me on some of the other, I guess, tools that I use to design activities and other things to think about. But I thought that was really handy to be able to present something, and if it doesn't work out, you get really handy feedback.
Yeah.
And if it does work out, it's great. But it also gave me the courage to try those things out in the open, because what's the worst thing that's going to do? It's not going to happen. And I'm actually in the middle of piloting a pretty large new thing at my company right now. And I've stacked hands with the leaders and they're excited, but they also acknowledge it's a pilot, and
Yeah.
it's not as scary, I think, as it would have been before that activity.
That's so great to hear. I mean, the opportunity to practice intentionally in a safe space and get and receive feedback from other talented professionals is something that really, really I value. And I think it's really important, and it's rare and it's hard.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that that opportunity like was helpful for you.
Yeah, and I can yes and that. For the lab that I did, it was really fantastic because so one of the things about the masterclass is that I was able to identify people who facilitated. There were lots of different people who facilitated lots of different things. And so then I'm thinking about Greg. So a lot of what he facilitated, or his facilitation, is about divergent thinking. And so the majority of stuff that I facilitate is trying to get people to converge and align. And so I was able to, I was like, what will I do? What would I want my lab to be? And I'm like, okay, I want my lab to be something that I don't get a chance to do. And so then I was able to reach out to him via the Slack channel and say, hey, could we line up some time to talk? And I was able to use talking to him and getting some advice about how he facilitates divergent thinking conversations to help create my lab. And then I got to have a fantastic conversation with my peer group that we met with about what it was I was working on doing. And then I had another meeting with the person who was going to be handling the feedback part. So
Wow.
it was just, I mean, and so it really was a master class because I was getting to talk and work with masters,
Yeah.
you know, in all sorts of different facets of facilitating.
That really makes me so happy, Brandon, that I mean, I say that you get out of it what you put into it. And you put a lot into it, and that's really amazing. And one thing that I heard that makes me really excited is in previous versions of the masterclass, I made the peer coaching mandatory, and I made the groups. And in a classic gambit of lazy facilitation and stepping back and letting the team facilitate itself, I let you form your own peer groups and own them. And it sounds like it kind of worked, which is really exciting for me.
Yeah, it absolutely worked. And I was so glad that you said, and it really did resonate with me when you said you will get as much as you will get as much out of this as you put into it. And I took that to heart
Yeah.
and said, okay, well, I'm going to really, really lean into this because it's a master class. And like where this conversation started from, this realization, once I realized, oh, this is not tips and tricks. This is like, you know, like this is developing yourself as a facilitator. You
Yeah.
need to lean into that.
Yeah. Beck, anything to yes and on that? Because there's something I want to loop back to that you said earlier.
I have one yes and. When you said you were interacting with masters, I felt that way in regards to my peers in this master class. I thought that this was such a group of intelligent people, and all of our backgrounds were pretty diverse. And it was just really interesting getting to know people and getting to know how they use facilitation in their professional lives.
Yeah.
And really, the perspectives were so interesting to me. And it's just not that often, I think maybe because I'm in corporate world, you know, where you can get just such different feedback, and it's so helpful. man, just being surrounded by just people of such a high caliber was
Yes.
pretty special.
And from diverse, I mean, this is the thing that I really try hard to do, is that, having people from profit, nonprofit, corporate education, it's a very different mindset depending on where you're coming from. And this speaks to the idea that facilitation is about your values and what you want and what your goals are and the type of people you work with and where you're trying to get to together, and shaping the conversation based on what you want. And that
Yes.
feedback is just going to be so different based on all of those values, which means you get to pick and choose from a very bountiful smorgasbord. I don't know, maybe the analogy is going too far. I'll pull back. So you said something earlier, Becca, that I think is really important to double stitch on. And this is the idea of facilitation as something you do to people versus something you do with people. Or maybe you said this too, Brendan. I don't know. I'll have to go back in the transcript. To me, the facilitation masterclass is something I do with you all. I'm facilitating you, and there are things I do to you because they're set pieces that I do to you or for you, but it's something we're doing with each other. And I think this idea, and you said it, Brandon, of like, oh, here's a game, you don't like that, here's another one, here's this pressure, versus like, well, this is something we're doing together and we're co-creating. And it feels like that's a very powerful attitude to have about facilitation. It bleeds into this idea of leadership or facilitative leadership. And I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but I think it's just an important idea to sort of stretch out a little bit of. Certainly the masterclass is something I'm doing with you. And I think the reason is because I think facilitation is something that we do with people.
I think the way that it was run left me thinking a lot of times after that it had more of a coaching session feel.
Yeah.
And even at times mentally it felt like a therapy session after, because you do a lot of the work. Somebody else is not doing that work for you, but it helps. It sticks a little better than somebody handing you the answer. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Wasn't a sad therapy session.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I believe that there's like a personal human element, like we bring ourselves. I know Brendan is like a education professional too. Like I'm self-taught. So I don't know I probably should have just learned more from you, but what did you learn about what Becca's talking about, this sort of co-creative approach to make it stickier?
That's absolutely true. By not telling us or being prescriptive, it forces people to figure it out for themselves, which also means that there isn't that gap between the recipe and the then if we're going to take that analogy further, that you taught them this recipe that requires very specific equipment and very specific ingredients, then they get home and they don't have the equipment or an ingredient, so you understand, oh well, I could use zucchini instead of the squash in this recipe, and I can hand chop this instead of using a Cuisinart. That sort of that's what I feel like I got out of it.
I love that. Becca, you've had this happen to you in a cookbook, right? Like, what do I replace lingonberries with? And they don't explain it to you. And you're like, how much money do I have to spend on the spices?
How do I make brown sugar? I don't have any.
Yep.
Sorry, I cut you off, Brendan. I want you to finish that thought.
Oh yeah. And then I was just going to say that I think that the other element, Becca was talking about, like a therapy session, is that you were always really, really good about building in reflection moments.
Yeah.
And that reflection creates consolidation.
Yes.
And so I found myself that I would reflect. And then when I got into my peer groups, when we would meet, we would actually reflect on like, what was last week? What did you get out of it? What did I get out of it? And there I have much more, I have like lasting memories of,
Mm.
oh, I didn't get that part about this activity, but now that I'm hearing you reflect on it, I'm realizing that that was really a significant part of it. So I really, really liked my peer group, like a lot out of that experience.
That is awesome. So there's two more things I want to make sure I talk about. One is like who it's for and who it's not for, like who should not come to the master class. And maybe we can just talk about that really briefly. Who do you think this isn't for, based on your experiences of who it is for?
I would think, to me, I think that the masterclass name is appropriate. I would say that it's people who, whether they identify as being facilitators or not, it's people that already have some experience, I guess, leading conversations. And so have a little bit of familiarity with just maybe the practice of starting conversations and having conversations. Yeah. So, and maybe people like, I think that you would want, if people who don't have any type of knowledge about facilitating and expect that the class is going to teach them the fundamentals of facilitation, like that might be a challenge for them.
That's a great point. I think that you would definitely get more out of this class if you have a little experience under your belt, particularly if you've had some challenges, if you've crashed and burned a time or two. Get a bit more out of the course rather than coming in super fresh, because it might not cover the basics, like Brandon said, as thoroughly.
No, it doesn't. It's not, I mean, as you said, I've run facilitation boot camps in the past, and this is not that. I got tired of doing those. And in a way, like the facilitation masterclass is fun for me because it pushes my edge, because you all are masters too, which is exciting for me. I think the other thing, maybe the last thing to talk about is, or maybe there's something else, is you're the first cohort that happened when Facilitation Friday was sort of fully in swing. And the idea that, you know, there's a playbook and here it is, versus this is an ongoing continuous learning process. I think both of you have been to Facilitation Fridays, and I'm just wondering, like, what's it like, sort of like being part of this wave of conversations about this thing that we're all trying to be excellent in?
I love Facilitation Fridays. And after the master class, my eyes were open to what I got out of the master class, but also how much more growth I stand to have. So I've really enjoyed the Facilitation Fridays because they bring in new aspects, maybe an experiment or two, or, it's just kind of continual learning.
Yes.
And I'm really excited about that because, one, having a community of facilitators is exciting, just to get to know different people, but then also having that opportunity to continue to develop skills and continue to experiment and talk about, the overall idea and the concept of facilitation.
Yeah. And I like how it seemed to, there was like an interweaving. So it seemed like there were ideas that maybe had come out of past master classes that then people were bringing into the Facilitation Friday, and that then like people were inspired by what happened in that Facilitation Friday, and then we're bringing it into our cohort. So I like the intermixing of, it's a great opportunity to intermix the different facilitation masterclass cohorts.
Yeah.
So I definitely see the two coming together, and the labs in the masterclass really set people up to then participate in a Facilitation Friday,
Mhm.
and do an activity there, because you're creating, like, if you like, it's like, okay, well, this is what the model looks like of how to create a lab. You
Yeah.
did it in the masterclass. Now, how about doing it for a Facilitation Friday? So
Yeah.
I see it as, like, in the future, I want to continue using the Facilitation Fridays to, now that I'm learning how to create my own games, to think about,
Yeah.
okay, well, what game do I want to bring into the group?
I would love for you to bring a game into the group. I'm pretty excited. Pamela, I don't know if either of you were in her personal branding workshop that she did for the lab in the master class, but she's going to do it on Facilitation Friday. Because I even just looking at her mural setup, I was like, that looks fun. And it seemed like people got a lot out of it.
I conducted my lab on the same day she did. And when I saw her lab, I was envious. I wanted to be in the group. So when you said she was doing Facilitation Friday, I jumped on it so fast.
That's awesome. I know that feeling. It is tough when you have like the parallel sessions, but I also think it's interesting to learn from the sessions you're not in, just peering at them and just like hearing the high level feedback. You can still learn, which is cool. Okay, well, I know we're almost out of time. What haven't I asked you that I should ask you about the Facilitation Masterclass? You all have been extremely generous with your time and your perspectives, and I'm super grateful for it.
One point on who this class would be for, I think that this came up probably for the majority of us that joined the class. If you have experience in facilitation and leading groups, and you find yourself questioning, a master, am I a master? I don't know. Is this right for me? Is everyone going to be at a higher level? This class is probably for you. The majority of us entered the class thinking that, with a confidence issue. And one, it was helpful to see that everyone else was feeling the same way. And two, over the course of the 12 weeks, the class, through the process of experimenting and reflecting, really builds your confidence. So that would be just another kind of key takeaway that you would expect to get from the class.
Yeah. Closing thoughts for you, Mr. Sidwell?
I +1 all of what she just said, because I was trying to think of, what I would say my key takeaway was for the Facilitation Masterclass. And what just keeps on coming into my mind is that I think that I've learned how to be a less prescriptive facilitator, because now I'm actually aware that that my natural kind of inclination, because of the way I learned facilitating, was to be a prescriptive facilitator. And now I know I don't have to be a prescriptive facilitator, and the whole class really models what it looks like to not have a prescriptive facilitation, and just all of the incredible things that each person can get for themselves out of a course like that, by not super defining what each thing is supposed to be about and what the key takeaways are of each thing. So I really appreciated that.
Picasso could have drawn accurate figures, right? But he was trying to find his own art form. And that to me is, for people who take this seriously and who want to get better at it, as you said, Becca, it's like, it's not about being a master. It's about the pursuit of mastery and wanting to be good at this and wanting to work at it, because it doesn't come for free. It's not easy. I love the idea of not being as prescriptive, Brendan, because I think it's less hard if you aren't trying so hard to make it exactly a specific way, and being more open, improvisational, but also like, there are many ways to do this. And so if it goes sideways, then maybe that's okay, because sideways is maybe where it needs to go. Well, all right. Thank you so much, y'all. I'm going to ask you to just stay on for, we have a couple more minutes, but I'm going to close this particular conversation out with just like so much gratitude. The Facilitation Masterclass is literally the most fun thing for me. And it's been such a privilege and a pleasure to be in conversation with you both. And I look forward to seeing you all on Facilitation Fridays.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Absolutely.
And see